This is Mary Johnstone-Louis, and we are welcoming Andre Hoffman to the Oxford Conversations on Responsible Ownership. So Andre, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. You are Vice Chair of Roche Holdings, as well as the head of your family, of which you represent the fourth generation. Roche is going into its 125th year next year. So congratulations to you and your family on this. You are a very committed philanthropist in multiple areas, but most vocally in recent years, you've been very committed to issues around nature and nature-based solutions and protection of the environment. So thanks for joining us today as we think through what leadership means across all three of those platforms, as you as an owner, you as a family head, and also yourself in the philanthropy and impact areas that you do. And I just learned today that last year, 125 million people took drugs that Roche manufactured. Is that correct?
Not only manufacturers, but also discovered. Most of these drugs are now off patent and they're manufactured by other people. But yes, the number is correct. Yeah.
Excellent. And then that of the World Health Organization's top 50 drugs, 16 of them were discovered by Roche. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And there's a lovely publication which I'll be delighted to forward to you, which documents this. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, many congratulations. And also, it's a perfect backdrop as we think about this question that you wrestle with as you come into this role, really, of what does responsible ownership mean for you?
So, first of all, thank you, Mary. Thank you for inviting me to share some views. Yes, the responsible ownership is a very complex situation. For me, it has something to do very much with the trade-off between long-term and short-term. If you are an owner, and if you behave like an owner which looks forward to what the corporation should contribute to the public debate, you find yourself in a situation which is different than if you're just there as an employee. And I think we need to talk about agency issues when you talk about this. If an owner is recruiting a manager to run the company, he will fix some criteria which have to do with performance. If you are an owner, you're going to consider more the impact of the business and the way this business will develop going forward. So typically, the conflict between an agent and an owner are documented into this sort of impact versus profitability. I think that short-term profit is something that typifies professional management. You are being asked to maximize financial return because that is the way in which you are incentivized and the way in which you are remunerated. If you are an owner, what's more important is that the long-term substance of the company, its mission, its relevance, its impact on multiple stakeholders continues to grow with time and continues to grow in a way which will allow you in the long term to continue to have the influence. So you understand, I use the word continue 5 times now. This is really this long-term thinking. And for me, a responsible ownership is to never enter into activities which might put the long term into jeopardy. You are not there to, it's not a slash and burn approach, it's the forest recreation.
That's very helpful. And what's your view of the role of owners in society, and more importantly, more specifically, Roche is a family business. So you are listed, but the family retains a majority. And what's your view of the role of owners and a family business in society? So
if we look at the history of the corporation since the invention of the joint stock company and the invention of stock exchanges, we have a diverging path between long-term ownership and short-term ownership. Companies which are quoted on the stock exchange do not really influence their shares as much as they could. The ownership of the shares is the subject of somebody else's activity. You in the corporation have to focus on what the corporation does and how it does it according to the value that it does. But you don't do that just in order to satisfy shareholders. So this notion of shareholders as owner is something that really deserves reappraisal. We need to be able to look at the whole community that these corporations are serving, and they are all de facto interested in the future of that company. So shareholding is not as important as influence. And because we happen to have the majority of the shares, we can influence the way the company is acting in its sector and in its everyday. And that allows us to be a bit more than just financial stock bearers, but we are responsible for the culture, the contribution of that particular company to society. And that's a much more powerful thing than just being a shareholder.
And as you look at other family businesses or the role of family businesses in society more generally, what can you share about what your view is of how they're doing, if you can comment, and what you think family businesses can bring that's unique as owners?
So responsible ownership does not necessarily mean family ownership. I mean, there are models where you have foundations or you have trusts or indeed some sort of legal form that would be appropriate. For me, the trade-off is really between the benefit of the society as the corporation, as an entity, by opposition to the market in which it operates. So the corporation as an entity should be predictable, should be focusing on creating value that can be used time and time again by different generations, and should also be involved into making the world a better place. I know it sounds a bit corny, but we should contribute to the fabric of society if you really want to continue to play a role in it. We need to build something that has a long-term lasting effect. If you are just a short-term owner, if you own a stake in a company that is in pharmaceutical or in car making, it's just a financial investment. But the owner is somebody who's responsible for the long-term success of the company, and I think that's very important. I chair the sustainability committee of our family company, and I explained that to my fellow board members on the basis that we want the executive committee to deliver budget, as close as possible to budget. We want the board of directors to look at the short-term cycles, 5 to 10 years. But in the sustainability committee, we're actually focusing on the generation after the next. I like to talk about 100 years. I know 100 years sounds incredibly long nowadays, but I think that's the sort of time scale at which we look. In fact, because of this conversation, we have now transformed the way we run the business at Roche. We don't talk about 5-year plans anymore. We talk about 10 years aspirations. And so we do not put numbers to this. We just, we want to be able to achieve certain goals. One of them, just out of memory, is we want to provide twice the medical service to society at half the cost over the next 10 years. And we try to link up this notion of impact with notion of costs in a way that will contribute to, I hope, better healthcare for society.
And that's in the 10-year aspiration category.
That's one of the 10 years aspirations. Yes, we have 7 of those.
So how about the 100-year aspirations, Andre? How do you as an owner possibly translate a cross-generational or even a 100-year aspiration to a management team? What has been your experience with that?
So long term is a succession of short terms. So the important thing is that we as a corporation have to remain relevant. So we need to be close to the market, we need to understand what it is we contribute, and we need to make sure that we always think one step ahead. We have given ourselves as a mission, doing today what the patient needs tomorrow. Very much in this notion of long-term thinking. And we do that by not being just a pill manufacturer, concentrating on the innovation at certain part of the disease. So our main turnover contributor is is to identify druggable targets in the disease pathways that we investigate. And so you develop a substance, an innovation, some sort of compound, which you then apply to that particular development path, and that allows you to have an impact on the disease. But that is a technical thing. It's we can go on doing that for a long time. But what we really would like to aspire to is more a partnership model, where we become partners of the healthcare systems of the countries in which we operate, so that we can together evolve the agenda, which will be important in the future. For instance, at the moment, we can see that the cost of healthcare in some of the developed market is getting out of reach for the majority of the patients. So when I say cost of healthcare, I don't mean the cost of the drug itself. I mean the whole ecosystem around it. How do we actually make sure that the drug comes to the right patient? And the consequence of this is that we are more and more constrained by costs. So it is our duty as a partner to address this issue, and in partnership with the rest of this ecosystem, again, I cannot use a better word, to contribute to that. So, for instance, our drug has to be paid for on outcome basis. If the drug we sell cures a disease, then we get the money. If it doesn't, we don't. And you know, and these are the sort of thinking process in which we need to enter. So, if you want to give to the management this 100-year horizon, you have to start by saying you need to make sure that you don't manage yourself into obsolescence. You need to be constantly relevant to what the market does. And that means going that extra mile, not only being the pharma company, but also being the health company, the one that actually participates to it. Which is why we have a diagnostic department, which is inherently less profitable than the pharma business, but which contributes to this expertise we can bring to the health system.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, and then thinking about responsible owners more broadly, is your view that responsible owners have to be long-term owners?
No, so there we enter into a subject which I've been thinking quite a lot about recently. How do we actually know if our company is well run? You know, the system we have created for controlling company and controlling investments is very much based on the financial system. Over the past 450 years, we've evolved an accounting system, generally accepted accounting principles. You know, it started with the merchant in Amsterdam or in Venice, and they started sending these boats, and they needed some way of measuring something. So we come with accounting. What we don't measure is impact. And the difference between good management and bad management has a lot to do with the general success of the company, which is not only a financial issue. If I only focus on to increasing the share price or the dividends or the turnover, or the returns, or the margin, I will eventually end up in a place where there's less and less room for maneuver. I mean, I get sort of into a dead alley. So a responsible owner has to make sure that all these roads are open, and some of them are less profitable than others. But they do have a positive impact on the system in which we are. So for instance, they will help to reduce disease in a certain way for Roche. I mean, I don't have a practical example, but that's the thinking process. So I think this has very much to do with an accounting system. We need to be able to measure the impact that we have with our corporation on the social, on the human capital, but also on the natural capital, of course, as well as on the financial. Of course, nobody wants a company to lose money. If you're loss making, you're a problem, you're not a solution. And we're very much keen to be a solution. So the long-term ownership does not necessarily imply that it has to be a family block. It could be all sorts of different structures. And short-term ownership, if it participates to the same vision of trying to create real value rather than just financial value, could be a very good model as well. But at the moment, the stock exchange does not reward long-term does not reward long-term thinking, not even if you hold a share for a short term.
Thank you.
The contradiction there is in between a company exists and it manages itself for the benefit of the system in which it is, so for the stakeholders in a broader sense. But shareholders are only investing in these shares and holding the shares less and less long, especially as most of these, for big corporations, most of the shares are traded automatically anyway. And that results into a very short-term horizon. And that's something that is detached from the reality of the company. You're just dealing in papers. You don't really deal into the vision and the activity of the corporation. And that disconnect between the stock exchange and businesses, is very apparent. You see that more and more.
And you've been a very committed advocate for the role of nature and the natural ecosystems as supporting all activities, including business activities. What have you learned about how to influence outcomes in, for example, a family business on these very complex, very long-term issues, such as protecting nature and the environment?
So there is a bit of a philosophical dimension. How do we reconcile a business activity with the way we live our lives? If I'm in the office, I will say something like, every work deserves a salary. Every opportunity should be seized and prized. And then I go home and I meet my family. Most of them have never, they're living a life which is not the same as the one I have in the office. And we need to make sure that we approach humanity as a whole in a holistic manner. We are not a different person if we are at home or if you are in the office. It's just the way the society has been organized. Our partners have raised our children for zero money. It is the most important thing they can do. You cannot not reward that in a way, shape, or form. So for me, this notion of only what you can measure gets managed is dangerous. I mean, it's positive if you have the right system, but we don't have the right system at the moment, and so we put the emphasis onto wrong things, and that's something we need to address. I think it's okay to come to the office with the same values as you have in your daily life. We should, as employers, we should encourage you to be human rather than being just profit-oriented.
So speaking of employees, you have 95,000 employees. And I've heard you tell a story of actually thinking about the purpose of the company and actually yourself as an owner, writing down some sense of the purpose of the company and actually physically going yourself and sharing that internally within the company. Can you share that story briefly and just reflect on any lessons that you think would be important for owners in terms of having their sense of values or their commitments known within the company?
Sure. I mean, the important thing is to start by the obvious. The purpose of the company is not to make money, and that's the. It's what we've been taught at school. It's what we always sort of looked at. But if the purpose is just to make money, then you could be in any business, employing any measures and doing any metrics. So if you are in a corporation, if you are in a company, in a place where everybody sits together, you need to ensure that there is a common purpose to the business. So who are we serving? What can we provide them with? And what values do we want to apply to this? And for me, this notion of writing down, very simple line, doing today what the patient needs tomorrow, has been a way of bringing around the table an awful lot of different ways and mentalities, and realizing that a company is not owner-centric, a company is customer or even stakeholder-centric. So our purpose is the patient. We want to do something that the patient will benefit from in a very tangible way. I mean, we save lives, basically. And I think that's something that has allowed us to bring people together. I can share an anecdote. At the time when we acquired our American subsidiary, they had as a line for defining their activities, in business for life. We at the time were said that we innovate healthcare is what we were interested in. And over a series of meetings, we evolved this notion that what brings us together is the patient. We want to do that together for the benefit of the health systems. And we came up with doing today what the patient needs tomorrow. And that, in a very simple purpose, I mean, there are many ways of defining purpose. You can find much more sophisticated way of doing it. But that sentence has helped us to bridge all these gaps. And, there is a huge cultural gap between an innovative American Californian startup and an old established German influenced company. So finding a path of making I like the gastronomic example of mounting a mayonnaise. You want the mayonnaise to really be solid, and if you want to be able to achieve that, you need strong ingredients. And that particular conversation has helped us tremendously.
Very helpful, very helpful. So in light of all we've discussed, you're going into your 125th year of Roche next year. Why is it important that your family retain ownership within this business?
Well, I'm going to be my 25th year on the board as well. So, yeah. aware of this, of the length of this tenure. Look, if other owners want to fulfill the same activity of defending the values of the company, defending its identity, personifying it, then maybe we should think about it. But for me, there's a French expression, il faut suivre les affaires. And if you are an owner and you just sit on the side of the road cashing in the dividends and go and spend them in Monaco, you are not fulfilling your purpose. The long-term stable family ownership is a huge competitive advantage in a research-driven company. You know, innovation takes time, and if you want this to be possible, you need to have a long-term stability. So it happened that the family of my great-grandfather is still together, is still harmoniously working together for the benefit of the corporation. And as long as we can maintain that, then we need to make sure that we do it properly, that we do it in a way which allows us to personify this huge body of 95,000 employees present on all continents. And, there is a need for a certain sense of humanity in the company, and how better to personify than for a family. But of course, it's work. It's you know, it needs to happen.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. There's much more we could discuss, but this has been all for today for the Oxford Conversations on Responsible Ownership. Andre Hoffmann, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Marion. Thank you.